I'm continuing my Sopranos rewatch today with the second episode of Season 1, 46 long. Although this episode aired on January 17th, 1999, only a week from the pilot episode, the pilot was filmed in the summer of 1997, and from what I can gather, this episode was filmed in the early summer of 1998, meaning that for these actors it had been around a year since they had portrayed these characters. This is the only episode of the cold open, as it's called, which means there's a scene before the intro sequence. This starts at Tony's office in the Bada Bing. While the mobsters count their cash, they watch a newscast featuring a commentator noting that the golden age of the mafia is long over, and that the government's efforts to crack down on organized crime with long prison sentences, especially for drug-related charges, have broken the mob's code of silence. This is a clear recap of Tony's anxieties from the pilot about the good times being over, him coming in at the end, and how old-school values are evaporating, as well as foreshadowing Tony's eventual conflicts with both Christopher and Puss. But it also strikes a balanced tone by the humorous way Tony's crew talks to each other, and the hilarious visual of all these mobsters counting their money while someone describes the American Mafia declining to an eventual end. I especially like this shot here where it shows the commentators sitting at an empty table, and then it cuts to the table with the mafiosos, the crew there, counting all their cash. Their table is overflowing with money. The golden age of the Mafia may be over, but for The Sopranos, this is just the beginning. In terms of characters, this episode continues to develop the existing characters and introduces new ones. For existing character development, the comedic nature of Tony's crew at the cold open establishes the dynamics between the characters that would continue for most of the series. Polly repeats his jokes immediately to Sil, Chris and Big Puss have a misunderstanding over cloning, and Sil's recurring impression of Michael Corleone. Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. AJ and Fielder each have different reactions to Tony at breakfast. Fielder seems annoyed and says, "You're up early, Dad," to subtextually communicate her disapproval. Meanwhile, AJ seems amused by Tony's early morning antics. This is an important note about good writing. Showing different characters reacting differently explains to the audience how they're different. It's a good showing instead of telling technique. In the pilot episode, therapy allows Melfi to help Tony with only one main revelation regarding the ducks, but the therapy plotline there was mostly for exposition. Here, though, her skills as a therapist gradually chip away and reach beyond Tony's facade, intellectually exploring Tony's issues while remaining grounded in reality. This sets up her foundations as a meticulous and persistent therapist. For Uncle Junior, the truck-taking plotline is the next escalating domino in the conflict between Tony and Junior. The fact that Junior asked for a sit-down with the acting boss instead of working it out with Tony one-on-one, like Tony suggests, indicates that Junior is old school and at times thinks of Tony as more of a coworker than a nephew. This episode further establishes Junior as the antagonist in the first season. There's also more characterization of Tony's mother, Livia, the narcissistic Grumposaurus. She has a conflict with Tony about a live-in nurse named Perry Lynn. This conflict reveals Livia's casual racism, among other things. Tony also says something to Perry Lynn that could be considered racist, or at a minimum, presumptuous. This episode also introduces new characters, such as Adriana Lacerva, Chris's girlfriend, played by actress Drea De Matteo. In the pilot episode, she was the hostess at the restaurant Tony briefly sees Melfi at, but she made such a good impression on everyone that they decided to bring her back for a larger role when the series got picked up. There's also Brandon Falone, whose last name almost sounds like felon. He offers to help Tony set up his DVD player. He used to be in the Stuola. But Tony doesn't like him due to Brendan's drug use. This ties back to the cold open in the newscast about drug-related charges being the Achilles heel of the mob's code of silence. This is, in fact, the very first nail in the long coffin between Christopher, who gradually descends into a full junkie, and Tony. Another character introduces Georgie. He's a bartender and bouncer who works at the Bing. He annoys Tony. There's also Jackie Aprile, the street boss, who's running things while the family boss is a guest of the government. He'll later be referred to as Jackie Aprile Sr. when his son is introduced later in the show. This episode also introduces Mikey Palmisi, Junior's right-hand man. Tony briefly speaks to him, and it's clear that there's a thin layer of civility on top of some hostile subtext. Tony also makes a joke about F-face-itis, and I always laugh at the face Al Sapienza, the actor who plays Mikey, makes immediately afterwards. This is a good introduction and setup for Mikey as a season-long antagonist. The plot lines in this episode are brilliant. I love the moment in the Bing in which Tony is expecting a call from Serge, which Georgie messed up earlier, while Tony also argues with Chris about Brendan. There's a fire at his mother's house while Serge is on the other line, and Puss asks him for the plate number of the schoolteacher's stolen car. The chaos Tony is immediately thrown into dials up the tension immediately, as these events split into 3 separate plot lines. Let's recap them real quick. The Comley trucking plotline involves Christopher and Brendan hijacking trucks from a company that's already paying protection money to Junior, which means they pay him money on a regular basis in exchange for not being robbed. Junior has a sit-down with Tony and acting boss Jackie. Chris and Brendan are ordered to pay restitution, but they gripe that $15,000 is outrageous tribute. Chris and Brendan pay the tribute begrudgingly, but Brendan robs another truck and the trucker catches friendly fire. Tony is not happy to say the least. He orders them to return the truck and merchandise to Comley Trucking. The stolen car plotline involves Big Puss and Polly tracking down AJ's science teacher's stolen Saturn, or Saturn. This involves a minor subplot of Polly being angry at the fact that big coffee chains aren't being run by Italians. They find the carjackers up in the club and the car, but it's scrapped. So they have another Saturn stolen, hastily painted, and substituted for the teachers. It would be more ironic if he was a substitute teacher, I suppose. For the Tony and Olivia plotline, Tony calls his mother and she gets distracted, and her burning mushrooms start a house fire, which leads Tony to hiring a live-in nurse, who Olivia alienates because it's all big nothing. After she accidentally runs over her friend, Tony puts her into a nursing home, a retirement community, and this leads to a semi-emotional crisis for Tony, and he takes it to Melfi and he talks to her about it. There's some great plot-level details in this episode, like Tony calling his mother from the bin. In the pilot, Livia tells Tony that Artie calls his mother every day. That's probably why she responds by saying, "Look who finally calls," when he calls her. And her not understanding Tony's answering machine and calling it fancy is ironic, since in the same scene, Christopher arrives with the stolen DVD players and proudly proclaims that technology comes to the Bing. Another detail is that Melfi doesn't show up until the 16-minute mark versus the very beginning in the pilot. Tony revealing that his sisters are gone makes it obvious to Melfi and anyone observant that Livia is clearly toxic. Melfi's question about which loving memories did Livia give Tony, and he's just about speechless, is very telling, to say the least. And there's a scene with Tony with a shot of the empty pool before he talks about his mother being independent and driving her whole friends around, a reminder of Tony's anxiety about losing his family. All these plotlines have one thing in common: theft, which brings us to the next part: the themes. What's this episode about? Or is it all a big nothing? What makes me think I'm so special? This episode continues what would come to be known as the high standard of great writing on The Sopranos, an intersection of character, plot, and theme. It's clear that this episode is all about theft, but also about characters attempting to right these wrongs. It's about justice and the limitations of what it can do. In the Comley trucking plotline, Brendan and Christopher steal from Uncle Junior, and Boss Jackie orders restitution to be paid, money to compensate Junior for his loss. The sit-down with Jackie Aprile brings up an interesting subplot. Jackie has cancer, which is slowly stealing his health and ultimately his life. Seems like a bit of a parallel to Livia, whose mental deterioration impacts her life negatively. It also cleverly retcons the pilot episode's depiction of Tony as the boss of the family. Brendan mentions later how everyone knows Tony is the one who's really running things behind the scenes, something Tony doesn't entirely like hearing. In effect, Tony is usurping and stealing Jackie's authority as boss by acting as a behind-the-scenes puppet master, or shadow prince. Getting back to Comley Trucking, the restitutions may help Junior, but does he need the money? I wonder if it's more about respect than anything else. And it's doubtful Comley Trucking is going to see any of that cash, the people that were actually stolen from. Brendan and Chris are dissatisfied with this decision by Mafia management. Brendan calls this restitution outrageous tribute. They both know Tony is pocketing a sizable amount of this money. Tony is effectively stealing from them with impunity, whereas when they steal, they're punished. From their perspective, they're the ones being stolen from. Christopher also airs his grievance over not being a made guy after the Triborough Towers hit, in which he killed Email. He says he's not getting anywhere playing by the rules and thinks he's been cheated by having the rightful rewards of his hard work denied and taken away from him. When Brendan decides to keep hijacking trucks and a truck driver is accidentally killed, it's gotten beyond the point of compensation. As Tony says, you can keep hitting the dead man with a stick, but nothing will bring him back from the dead. Something similar happens with Mr. Miller's stolen Saturn. By the time Big Puss and Polly find the car, Humpty Dumpty and all his men ain't putting it back together again. They have the carjackers steal another car and paint it so it looks like the teacher's car. Somewhere in North Jersey, someone else is now missing a car, which means the cycle of theft and attempts at restitution aren't resolved, but merely perpetuate an unending circle. And when Mr. Miller wonders if all the papers he graded are in the trunk, we know he's going to be disappointed. There's zero chance of him getting those graded papers back now. The hasty paint job is unlikely to last, and I wonder if the car's VIN matches Mr. Miller's registration or that of a now stolen car. It might have been more constructive to let Mr. Miller's insurance company deal with the entire matter. Although, as Carmela notes in the beginning, the insurance companies never give full value. Again, the theme of theft and restitution being inadequate. It's also worth mentioning the subplot of Paulie resenting the coffee store chain, thinking that Italians are having their legacy stolen from them. Paulie steals from the store, but that's unlikely to change the situation in any meaningful way. The line from the clerk about "these stores are everywhere" is in some ways foreshadowing Season 6, when Patsy says it's over for the little guy. There's an interesting parallel in that Paulie, when he steals, he gets away with it clean, but Livia accuses Perry Lynn of stealing from her when she really hasn't. The added irony here is that Livia says Aunt Septimia stole that plate from Rome. Livia accuses Perry Lynn of stealing something that was stolen in the first place. And there's a long-standing issues between Tony and his mother. The conflict with Livia being put into a nursing home, retirement community, began in the pilot episode. Livia doesn't want her independence taken from her, and it's debatable if it's Tony, the passage of time, old age, or both, but her independent life is stolen from her. Yet another parallel between Livia and Jackie Aprile is Tony stealing autonomy and authority from others, forcing his mother to go to Green Grove in his personal life, and stealing Jackie's authority by acting as an undermining shadow prince behind the scenes in his business life. Another theft-related detail to the Tony-Olivia conflict is Livia's jewelry. She gave it away to one of Tony's cousins. Tony feels that it's his children's inheritance, and Livia gave away what was rightfully theirs. Livia is clearly toxic and had a negative impact on Tony's childhood development. In effect, Tony's childhood was stolen from him. As Melfi notes, this is the subconscious source of Tony's anger. And given Tony's inability to acknowledge this and confront it, it's doubtful that therapy, Prozac, or really anything for that matter, is going to heal the emotional damage that his mother inflicted on him. Going back to John Truby's Anatomy of Story and the notion of thematic rectangles, how can this episode be interpreted? Well, the first thing I noticed was the conflict between an individual's duty versus being selfish. In business, this is shown through the calmly trucking plotline and how Brendan and Christopher react to Junior's absurdly high tribute demands. Christopher has a moment of clarity and decides he's going to respect the rules of the mob. Otherwise, why be in a crew? Brendan chooses to steal anyway. Perhaps not just for money, but it's also because it's his way of saying capital F and capital U to both Tony and Junior. Tony chooses to help his mother secure a spot in Green Grove, one of the best retirement communities in North Jersey. When Melfi asks him why he continues to help his mother, Tony says that Livia is his mother, and he's supposed to take care of his mother. Livia is quite the opposite. Her narcissism or psychopathy, whatever happened there, is exactly why she wasn't able to fulfill her duty to be a loving mother to Tony. Another way to look at the themes is theft and restitution. Christopher admits he did something wrong. He pays the tribute. It's also an interesting note that Chris is okay with paying, but he disagrees over the amount. A similar opinion is offered by Hesh in a later episode. Brendan keeps doing it though, seemingly in denial about the damage he's doing. Junior admits he's been wronged and seeks a resolution at a sit-down. Unlike Junior though, Tony denies that Livia is toxic and displaces the anger towards Georgie. This episode continues the great thematic writing of The Sopranos. The plot pits Tony in the middle of a conflict between Chris and Junior, the up-and-coming generation and the old guard of the Mafia. Livia is taken from her home, like Italians leaving Italy and going to America. Are they still Italian after this many generations? Are they trying to reclaim a lost legacy, like Tony watching the newscast at the beginning, being reminded of the glory days of the mob that he's trying to recapture, along with a lost childhood, or Paulie stealing from the coffee shop as a matter of pride? The truth is that Green Grove is a nursing home. Someone else's painted Saturn isn't Mr. Miller's actual car. And these wise guys can wear 46 long Italian suits. But they don't speak Italian, something made obvious when the nursing home director recounts the old Italian proverb about time and patience changing the mulberry leaf to silk. For all of these characters, they're trying to recapture something they feel they've lost, yet they're in denial about either the problem or the solution. Their efforts to do so don't fill the void and only make things worse, like throwing water on a grease fire. Now there's some memes introduced in this episode, the most notable being Silvio saying, "Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in," which is of course a Godfather 3 reference. Livia with her line, "Oh, poor you," and Tony with his line of, "Did you warble, my little wren?" which is a quote from an old movie called The Bank Dick. Tony claims he watched it on his new stolen DVD player, provided by Chris when he robbed Comley Trucking. There's also Tony's line about the hotel at Captain Teeb's. When Melfi tells him this, she's actually talking about a hotel at Cap d'Antibes. It's a resort peninsula in the French Riviera, but Tony comically misunderstands her. There's also the line about, I know seniors who are inspired, that Melfi says about Green Grove, that Tony later repeats. There's also some pop culture references. Although Tony and Christopher have a chat with Hesh at the Bing in the pilot episode, it isn't named until this episode. The name Bada Bing itself is a reference to The Godfather, in which Sonny tells Michael that killing people in the mob isn't like shooting people at 200 yards. Michael was in the Marines during World War II, by the way. In the mob, you have to get up close and bada bing! Also, Uncle Junior has some lines in here that are a little racist. Junior calls Tony's crew a bunch of Chiricahuas, which is a Native American Apache band, often portrayed in old westerns. I think this is semi-related to Junior's later line about, relaxed or take it easy, we're not making a western here. Junior also mutters under his breath to Jackie that Tony hired a Smoke for his own mother, with Smoke presumably being a racist term for an African-American or a person of color. Big Puss has a line where he says, I'm effing Rockford over here, when one of his employees at his body shop gives him a lead on the stolen teacher's car. This is a reference to a detective show, but also the pilot episode, in which the theme song to Rockford is playing in the background when Tony and his family take Livia to Green Grove for a tour. He also says, O Trippa de Zia, which is like a Neapolitano slang term of some kind. I'm not sure what it means exactly. J.D. Williams has a minor role as the hijacker that drops his gun and accidentally kills the trucker. He would later go on to play Bodie in The Wire, another HBO show, in 2002. Tony tells Perry Lynn that while she's watching Livia, no ganja. Ganja is a slang term for weed. Perry Lynn is understandably insulted by Tony implying that she uses drugs. Tony also mentions the flowers he got his mother are from the same florist Frankie Valli uses. Frankie Valli is a famous singer from Newark, New Jersey. Brendan's line, yo, money, that he says to Christopher, and actually Christopher says this in the pilot episode to Emo. This was like a Gen X 90s slang thing that got used quite a bit back in the day. Livia uses the racist term ditsoon to describe Perry Lynn, the Trinidadian nurse who stays with Livia when it's clear Livia can't live alone. This term is supposedly a corruption of the word tizone, which is the Italian word for coal. Martin Scorsese makes a cameo at the club while Christopher and Brendan are waiting in line. It's very clear that Martin Scorsese is more popular than Kenny Portugal. Now for the whack count of this episode and the running total, a trucker is killed by not the Bodie, but it's accidental, so I'm not calling it a whack. So the running total was 1 whack carried over from the pilot episode, and 1 manslaughter charge for not the Bodie. So 2 deaths in total, but only 1 whack. In conclusion, this episode features the only cold open, which does a good job of reminding the audience of Tony's anxiety and goals. The second episode here is kind of like a sequel. It's essential for maintaining the standard the pilot episode started. And in terms of acting, production, and writing, this episode does exactly that. Also, I don't know if they used a dummy for this scene with Fanny being run over, or if it's a stunt person, but if it's a stunt person, that's really good stunt work. One detail I did pick up here when I rewatched this episode was Big Puss saying that with his all week remark, because he tells the carjackers that he spent all week looking for that car. And I think that's actually interesting because I don't think we're often given necessarily a time frame for these episodes, but it implies that this episode took place over the course of a week. There's some good themes in this episode that are tied to characters and plot. The sit down with Junior I especially like in this episode because it just seamlessly blends like the business side and the personal life of Tony. When it quickly moves from the sit down talking about business to Junior talking about Tony's mother and taking care of her, I always thought that scene was in particular really interesting. And when Jackie Aprile mentions naming a successor, Tony also asks, who wants the job this day? Which is actually seemingly the opposite of what he really means. I don't remember when, but I do think David Chase at one point mentioned that on The Sopranos, characters often say the opposite of what they actually mean and the opposite of what they actually feel. And this is probably a pretty good example of that. This episode was written by David Chase, but it was directed by Dan Attias. In particular, I do like how Daniel Attias frames a particular shot of Tony and his face being half in the light and half in the dark, because this particular season does have like a looming question of, is Tony the family man or is Tony actually like the mafioso? And which personality is stronger? Which part of him and his being is actually the real Tony? And that's a question that comes up later in the episode College, but I like this particular shot here. In terms of the writing from David Chase here, this episode introduces new characters and sets up plot lines needed for the remainder of the season. Looking back on this episode, at the end of 46 Long, The Sopranos is no longer a pilot episode, but a full-fledged television show. And that's all I have for 46 Long, Season 1, Episode 2 of The Sopranos. Thank you for watching. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe. And feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts about this episode. And I'll be continuing my Sopranos rewatch with Episode 3 of Season 1, Denial, Anger, Acceptance. And until next time, have a good one.